Hello and welcome into the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host TJ Mabarty. Today is Thursday, April 13th, and we are just about, it seems at least that we are just about to crown an NBA champion, where last night the Boston Celtics defeated the Dallas Mavericks in Game 3 in order to take a 3-0 series lead, a lead that has never been blown in NBA playoffs history, and it seems as if the Celtics are going to be the 2024 NBA champions. So we are going to be breaking down Game 3, how this all played out. We're additionally going to be touching on Luka Doncic, who has been obviously an incredible player throughout this postseason run. We know one of the best players in the world, but has had as much as some of the numbers pop out, overall a pretty disappointing finals appearance, and specifically in Game 3 really struggled. So we're going to be diving into that, an update on the finals MVP odds and where those currently stand, as we have a new favorite as of this morning, how the Celtics got to this point, and finally some updates outside of the NBA finals but on the Cleveland Cavaliers, who are making some noise with their plans for the offseason. So we're going to be diving into all of that. But before we do so, just a reminder to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. To our live viewers, be sure to use the comment section and give us your thoughts on the latest happenings in sports. And if you would like to become a bigger part of the show, you can use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker, gsmcpodcast.net. If you leave a tip or donation with a comment, that comment will pop up on screen for everyone to see. Anything in that department would be greatly appreciated. The Boston Celtics had a little bit of a roller coaster win last night in Game 3. They come out on top 106-99. It was clear that the Mavericks, with their backs against the wall in the series deficit coming into this game, came out with a level of fire, and they were throwing the punches early in this one, built themselves up a 13-point lead, but even after that, it just didn't seem like they were necessarily going to be able to match up with the Celtics team, where we saw early on Kyrie Irving was getting himself going. He had a massive bounce back performance. As Jaylen Brown put it, it was vintage Kyrie, but it wasn't enough. And despite the Mavericks taking that 13-point lead early, the Celtics were able to quickly battle back and make it just a 1-point game by the end of the first quarter. Jayson Tatum had easily his best quarter of the finals so far this year. You can say even the half as a whole, 13 points in the first quarter, another 7 in the second quarter to make it 20 in the half. And he and Kyrie both, I mean, for some degree, obviously, Tatum's on the winning end, but I did think that this was overall a pretty good Kyrie Irving performance, even though obviously with how everything played out at the end with Luka Doncic fouling out, all eyes were on Kyrie, and he wasn't necessarily able to overcome the odds. I have a hard time single-handedly blaming him for that. Kyrie scored 15 points in the second half, finished the game with 35. He was 13 of 28 from the field. He finally found his three-point shot, 4 of 6 from the three-point line after being 0 for 8 in the previous 2 games combined. But like I mentioned, as much as it felt like things were going in favor of the Mavericks during the first half, you look up and it is just a 1-point game. Jayson Tatum has his 20 points, but outside of that, the next highest scorer for the Celtics was Sam Hauser, who came off the bench and hit 3 threes. But Jaylen Brown really struggled offensively in that first half, just 6 points on 2 of 6 from the field. And then in came the Celtics tsunami, I believe it was, that Mike Breen described it as in the third quarter, where the Celtics just absolutely took over there. Jaylen Brown really woke himself up, and he was phenomenal down the stretch of that quarter. Celtics were 11 of 18 from the field, 5 of 11 from 3. They scored 35 points to Dallas's 19. Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown together outscoring the entire Mavericks roster. So the Celtics closed the quarter phenomenally as well, which has been a little bit of a topic of conversation with this Celtics team, is they have struggled to close quarters in the past, and this time it was Jaylen Brown putting the exclamation point when he crossed up Kyrie, I believe it was, at the top of the three-point line and got himself through the lane for a vicious dunk that again just made it feel like everything was all Celtics. The Celtics lead ended up blossoming up to 21 points early in the fourth quarter, and then we saw again, as much as this is a great win for the Celtics and they are on the brink of a championship, we saw a lot of the old Celtics, the ones that has had people hesitant to go ahead and pick them in this series and for the past number of years, where late in these games it just seems like their offense gets a little bit stagnant, where they, and especially in a scenario like this where they were playing with a 21-point lead, it seemed like the only thing that was going against them at that moment was the clock. So they were trying to wind it down. They were starting their action in those possessions far too late, and it was just resulting in bad mid-range shots and a lot of forced shots at the buzzer. And ultimately, the Mavericks started to go on this run that got to 22-2. And just like that, it was a 3-point game in the fourth quarter, which brings in the conversation of the referees that has a lot of people up in arms this morning, where Luka Doncic, in I believe it was 3 possessions, fouled twice on the defensive end. It was a Jaylen Brown post up in the short corner on one. That, listen, a lot of people are arguing that it could have been a Jaylen Brown offensive foul. It could have been. They could have possibly challenged that one, where Jaylen did sort of have his arm around. Now, Luka was also tugging at the Jaylen Brown jersey. Again, it's up to you really to decipher how you think that it should have been called, but it was called a foul on Luka. And then from that point, Luka has to be more heads up that the Celtics are going to attack him in that moment. The Celtics, really all series long, have been going after Luka Doncic on the defensive end. We're going to get into some numbers later in the show here, talking about the struggles that Luka's had on defense, not just in this series, but in the playoffs as a whole. Yes, I know he's also been dealing with injuries, so I'm not saying it 100% has to be an indictment on who he is and who he's going to continue to be in his NBA career, but the defense for Luka has been abysmal. And even on that 22-2 run, it was the Celtics attacking Luka to get their couple points there. But point being, Luka ends up trying to step in, and I think he was maybe trying to draw a charge from Jaylen Brown. It definitely wasn't an offensive foul. You can make an argument again that maybe the refs just have to swallow their whistle in that moment, but ultimately Luka has to understand that as the best player on the other team with 5 fouls, the Celtics were going to attack him. And for as much as Luka throughout the entire series was just sort of allowing players to blow by him, that this is the instance you want to step in and intervene, there was no way he was getting that charge call in this instance. He wasn't even close to being set. Obviously, your feet where they are isn't the only factor in that situation, but again, I just thought it was far too risky of a move for Luka to try and step in there in transition against one of the best transition players in the NBA and Jaylen Brown, and then get absolutely fired up afterwards, yelling over at his bench to challenge the play afterwards, where you put yourself in that position. But again, we're going to be getting into Luka shortly, but ultimately, with 4:14 left in the game, Luka fouls out, And at that point, it just feels like it is wraps for the Celtics, where the Mavericks have been this fun dark horse team, especially through the entirety of the second half of the season. They've been an awesome watch, but it's still an offense that is very reliant on isolation basketball. And taking Luka out of the equation, it was entirely on Kyrie at that point. And listen, again, I know he didn't necessarily step up to the heroics of 2016 Kyrie when he hits the shot. They actually referenced that exact shot when he tried to pull up over Al Horford with about 25 seconds left in that game. But an extremely difficult shot to hit, and ultimately, once Tim Hardaway Jr. comes onto the court, who, listen, I know that I'm not going to throw any shade or anything, but when Michael Wilbon is talking about, Tim Hardaway Jr. is the key to the series, he said that, I believe, prior to Game 2. Udonis Haslem on ESPN as well is talking about Tim Hardaway Jr., who's been in all these big moments. It's been clear that the Mavericks have not trusted him whatsoever, and and again, not to get on this whole Tim Hardaway Jr. rant here, but, at that point, it was taking away your offensive creator. Definitely struggled on defense as well, but Tim Hardaway Jr. was no better on the defensive end and didn't provide any of the offense, where I don't think that he's scored a point yet in this series in general. So it was definitely a very tough sequence there for the Mavericks. The Celtics end up closing it out, their 10th straight win in the playoffs, and now are on the potential brink of being the first team in NBA history to sweep both the conference finals and the finals, doing so because of the big shot from Jaylen Brown where he scored in isolation. I believe it was over Tim Hardaway Jr., and that ultimately wrapped it up. The Celtics win this game, and that definitely will have some impact. I feel like the shot that Jaylen Brown hit on the finals MVP odds, which we're going to be diving into later in the show as well, but ultimately it was just a situation where it's clear that the Celtics team is just so much deeper than the Mavericks, despite what some of the narratives were coming into the series. And I thought that this was the best bench game of the playoffs from Boston's three players that they rolled out on the bench, including Xavier Tillman, who was not getting minutes for the Celtics for the majority of this postseason. I believe he only briefly played in the Cleveland series, and outside of that, it's been a non-factor. I can look back at it as well. He might have gotten a little bit of run time as well in the Pacers series as well. Did have a couple games where he got some actual minutes, but ultimately Sam Hauser, Peyton Pritchard, you have the three-pointers that went down, specifically Hauser. Xavier Tillman hit the corner three as well, but in most part, it was the defense and the way that Luka and Kyrie were trying to seek out these guys on the offensive end or the defensive end from the perspective of these three players, and they did a tremendous job holding up against Dallas's stars. And again, you look at last series for the Mavericks where they played the Minnesota Timberwolves, who are one of the greatest defenses that we've seen in recent history, and the way that the Celtics just have this elite level of switchability has been tremendous. But we are going to continue on that conversation of the way that specifically you look at Hauser and Pritchard and how they guarded Luka Doncic, who overall struggled in this game, both from a shooting perspective, the defensive perspective that we already talked about, and some of the maturity levels. He made some very interesting comments after the game, after he fouled out, talking about the level of physicality that they were allowed to play with and such. And there was definitely a level of irony to those comments that I want to dive into. But before we do all of that, we're going to be taking our first break of the show. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh,
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Luka Doncic, after fouling out last night, made some comments in the post-game interview that rubbed myself and a lot of people the wrong way, where he was asked about the fact that he fouled out and how the refs were in this game, and he said that it was tough that they, quote, couldn't play physical because of the refs. And for Luka, who, listen, it has been a storyline the entire postseason, really for a lot of his career as well, but so much so that it seemed like the Mavericks were having these moments where they were having to sit Luka down and almost intervention style say, you have to stop talking to the referees. For him to be complaining about the extra calls is just something that was very ironic overall, because of the fact that if you look at the way that the Celtics approached this Game 3 matchup against him, it was clear, especially from the perspective of these bench players, where Luka is one of the best players in the NBA at seeking out mismatches and taking advantage of that. But it was clear that the Celtics specifically sat down their bench unit, and it seemed like they said, listen, you are going to get picked on when you're on the court. And it seemed like it was this level of scouting, of understanding Luka is going to try and bait you into fouling him. And there were a couple instances that really stood out to me. There was one in the second quarter where Luka was trying to post up Peyton Pritchard. He backed him down, and then when he tried to sort of lean into Pritchard to then throw up the shot, you could see Pritchard almost dip. I believe it was his right shoulder, basically underneath Luka's elbow, where Luka was trying to initiate this contact, and Pritchard understood that and was able to avoid it, forces the miss there. There was another instance with Sam Hauser when this was in the first quarter, where Hauser, he got put into the game, and almost immediately Luka was trying to put him into some action. He had a tremendous game. It was the 3-point shots, which was massive for him, but there were multiple instances where PJ Washington tried to post him up at one point. Kyrie tried to put him in isolation, and there was one instance as well with Hauser where he was guarding Luka, where Luka had him on the right wing, and he drove in, and Luka was throwing all of these different pump fakes at Hauser on the right elbow, and he ended up ultimately having to settle for a fadeaway after Hauser didn't bite. And overall, it just sort of played to the fact that I thought that Luka spent, as he does frankly a lot of the time, spent too much of the game focusing on the referees on both sides of the ball, where he wasn't playing his game. He was trying to play the referee game, which is obviously a part of sort of his masterful offensive approach at times, where he is able to sort of get less experienced players to foul him. But we've seen this with James Harden for a decade plus, where whistles aren't blown quite as much. And listen, I understand Luka fouled out. We're going to dive into that as well. But Luka ended up finishing this game 11 of 27, 1 of 7 from 3, where on some of these three-pointers, he's falling down. And to the James Harden comparison, when you are playing a 7-game series, there is going to be a level of scouting from these rival NBA teams that you just don't get on a night-to-night basis during the regular season. And Luka was, again, it seemed like so fixated on trying to put these bench players of the Celtics in compromising positions that he ended up hurting himself. And he really struggled in this game as a whole. We've talked about some of the defensive numbers as well. ESPN put up a graphic this morning during one of their shows where Luka, it had some horrendous stats in terms of defensively, the highest blow-by percentage allowed on drives in a playoff series in the past decade. Luka has the top 3 worst blow-by percentages allowed. It was 59% against the Thunder in the conference semifinals, 65.2% against the Clippers in the first round, and now 67.7% against the Celtics so far through 3 games in the finals. And Luka has been given all of this praise for the effort that he's been putting out on the defensive end. I just don't feel like it's accurate to what we are actually seeing on the court. And now people are sort of turning around, and now that people are seeing it, I don't want to bash Luka and say he's not a top X player in the NBA, because we know how incredible he is. But this is very clearly a real flaw in his game. And I understand that Luka is dealing with these injuries, and hopefully it's something that in time he can sort of correct and work itself out. But ultimately, it's a real issue right now, injuries in this postseason or not. And some of that also plays into the conditioning, where that's why, along with the Celtics going at him so much when he's on defense, that it does just provide this extra level of the conversation surrounding his conditioning, that he needs to be better conditioned in these types of games. Again, also, for whatever it's worth, the James Harden comparison, we have talked about that with him as well. And, Luka, again, I don't want to take away from this postseason run in general, because there is a 0% chance the Mavericks could make it to this point without Luka. So he deserves tons of credit for the Mavericks being here in the first place. But to see him have that type of a game in Game 3, where it's at home, you actually get the performance of Kyrie Irving surrounding him, it is really frustrating as a pure basketball fan to see him then go in the post-game interview and basically blame the referees. And Brian Windhorst of ESPN had a pretty epic bashing of him after the game when he was on the Scott Van Pelt show afterwards, and I really did agree with the majority of what he was saying. There is a level of maturity that Luka still needs to come to. Keep in mind, 25 years old. He's been playing basketball for a decade plus professionally when he was in Europe as well. So, again, a young player who has, you can say, overachieved basically his entire life in regards to his basketball skills. But there is a level of maturity that he still has to hit. That's something we said about this Celtics team on the other end for a number of years now. And this idea of when Jason Kidd throws out the idea of Jaylen Brown as their best player, trying to play mind games between him and Tatum, the Celtics have learned to just drown out all of the noise, all of the criticism. Been one of the most heavily criticized teams to have the level of success, 79-20 on the season as a whole, and that level of maturity. And part of that was falling in the NBA Finals a couple years ago. This is an experience Luka is going to have to learn from, and I believe that he is fully capable of it. Now, Windhorst also said an interesting point in terms of somebody from the Mavericks or just somebody in his life needs to sit him down and sort of lay out the understanding of what is going on with your interactions with the refs. And Windhorst said that nobody has done that in his entire life, which is a little bit harsh, but also the way that Luka acts. I mean, he was basically begging for a technical foul for a lot of this game, getting up in the faces of referees. There was one clip after, I forget exactly what play it's after, but Luka, who also, keep in mind, all of these things baked into one conversation, there were numerous instances where the Celtics were able to have numbers going the other way because Luka would fall down, sit, pout a little bit, and argue to the refs before actually running back on defense. And that's where the Celtics got some of their best looks on the night as a whole. So again, all this to be said, I don't want to diminish Luka and how incredible of a player he is, but this is sort of the part where, after making 5 straight All-NBAs and understanding how incredible he is, that he's in the MVP conversation, he's a top 4 player, I think definitively. I'd probably have him, top 3 even. Between him, Jokic, Giannis, I believe that that's the top of the top. Again, all subjective. You can argue in the comments if you'd like to. But ultimately, again, we know Luka is elite. But once we get to this point in basketball discourse where, especially when we see you on the biggest stage with the most consequences there, we are going to talk about some of the shortcomings. And again, we can appreciate everything Luka has done in the postseason up to this point and also acknowledge that there is room to grow. No NBA player is perfect. And for Luka, it has to be, as much as it's the defense maybe, I think that the number one thing for him is the mentality of trying to abandon this constant complaining to the referees, because his skill set when he is firing is one of the most fun players to watch in the NBA. But at the same time, again, it is just so hard to watch him after every single play go and yell at a ref. But let me know if in the comments section if you think I'm coming off too harsh, what your thoughts on his Game 3 performance were. But we are going to look on the other side of this finals game next, talking about the finals MVP, where as of this morning we have a new favorite to win, how this is all sort of shaped out, and what the odds currently look like. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast. For months now, especially during the playoffs here, it has been a very large media conversation of who is the best player on the Celtics. It feels like at this point, with the Celtics up 3-0, we have sort of put those narratives to some degree to rest now that the Celtics seem to be at least on the brink, or they are on the brink of a championship. Feels like it is going to head that direction. And it is Jaylen Brown who has emerged as the finals MVP favorite. I don't think that that's necessarily indicative of who the best player on the Celtics is, but an extremely well-deserved movement where Jaylen Brown was clowned a lot of the offseason, throughout a lot of the regular season, after he became the highest paid player in NBA history after signing his Supermax extension with the Celtics. And the Celtics were very heavily criticized for giving out that type of contract based off of the way that the seasons have played out in recent years of making these deep postseason runs, but it seemed like there has been just some sort of blocker in the way. And now we've seen the Celtics go, I believe it's now up to 13-2 in the postseason. They are 79-20 on the playoffs as a whole. They have a chance to become one of the only teams in NBA history to win 80 games and have 20 losses or less. 6 teams are a part of that category. It's the 1996 Chicago Bulls with Michael Jordan, 97 as well. The 2017 Golden State Warriors, the 1986 Boston Celtics, 1987 Los Angeles Lakers, and the 2015 Golden State Warriors. So some of the best teams in NBA history have been able to reach this mark of 80 plus wins and 20 or less losses. And the Celtics, it seems like the biggest thing, because ultimately when you look at who is playing these impactful minutes for the Celtics on the court, for the most part, there really isn't all too much of a difference of the rotation players playing in these games this season in comparison to last, where Drew Holiday, absolutely a massive get for them. But outside of that, Kristaps Porzingis was as well, but he has played in minimal minutes throughout this postseason, and I don't believe that the Celtics they're definitely not up 3-0 if Porzingis doesn't play in these first couple games, but he has missed about half of the Celtics postseason games so far this year. It's been a ton of the internal improvement from this Celtics organization, and I believe in large part it is Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum who have learned to not just coexist and not necessarily worry about who is the alpha and who's the true number one. It's just about getting the job done. They have been on the doorstep of winning a championship for a number of years now, and they are currently at a point where it seems like they are willing to sort of put the narratives aside and just focus on winning now. Now, I'm sure it's going to be a conversation from here on out. Once you get the one championship, we'll see whether or not Jaylen Brown would like to become a bigger star. Jayson Tatum, at least for marketability nationally and I would say in Massachusetts, is seen as the true number one. But if Jaylen Brown gets the Finals MVP here, I have a hard time imagining that he's going to be too upset being the highest paid player in the NBA. That being said, Jayson Tatum's probably going to surpass him this offseason. But I think that dynamic will be interesting to see how it plays out over time. But Jaylen has just been on an absolute heater for the Celtics, and it goes back to winning the Eastern Conference Finals MVP, where that one was definitely a little bit of a debate. This one, I think that ultimately with Jaylen Brown, because of some of the inconsistencies with scoring, it makes sense that he is going to be favored over Jayson Tatum. But, both of them have been tremendous. And again, the Tatum shooting is something that is absolutely something you can point to, which is probably what favors Jaylen Brown in this instance. Now, a minus 280 favorite on DraftKings, Jayson Tatum at plus 250. This was Jayson Tatum's, you could say, award to lose to some degree. He's been the favorite for at least since the conference finals, and we even had the finals matchup set and headed into the series as well. Jayson Tatum was the odds-on favorite, but it's now shifted in favor of Jaylen Brown, who this series has been averaging 24 points per game on 55-25% shooting splits. The threes haven't necessarily been there for him, but we're also seeing him average 5.7 assists, something that has not necessarily been a massive part of his game. And if you're talking about the future outlook of this Celtics team, something that's really interesting, because Tatum has done a phenomenal job over the course of the past couple years. Really, if you want to look back to 2022 and that final series, for as bad as it was for Tatum, really struggled with turnovers, that's when we did see him at least start to understand a little bit more, making the right plays at the right time in terms of his facilitating and his playmaking. Now, obviously, it was very clunky then, and it's been a growing process since then, where that's why I don't believe he did play definitively bad in these first couple of games, because he was providing a lot of extra stuff outside of the scoring. But Jaylen Brown is starting to show off that ability to have a little bit of a better IQ passing the ball as well. And ultimately, this Celtics team is just built by committee. It's not like it is the traditional one player takes over a game and leads his team to victory. It's not the LeBron James model, but it is a little bit of that maybe. And even when you look at the 2017-18 Warriors, it was Kevin Durant who time after time was who the Celtics went to or the Warriors, that is, went to take the big shot. The threes that he hit over LeBron in back-to-back years in the finals are sort of those staple moments. Steph Curry didn't necessarily have that. But by no means does that say that Steph Curry wasn't an invaluable piece to that Warriors team, because it changes the way that they play and it changes the way that other teams can play defense against them. So, making these comparisons, obviously I'm not saying the Celtics are on that same level of the Warriors necessarily. They still have a lot of proving to do, and that's something that we're going to be touching on in the next segment as well. But just generally speaking here, the Celtics are at a point where, from a regular season perspective, this has been one of the best runs in recent history. Now, you can point to who they played in the postseason and say wasn't quite as strong. Absolutely, I understand that, which is why I don't believe they are going to be put in these all-time conversations just yet. But if you are just looking at what they were able to do this year, how they were constructed to do so, it's because they have two number one options essentially in Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And ultimately, if Brown wins this award, I don't think it is a definitive lock necessarily just yet, but it does feel like Brown is a little bit of the overwhelming favorite here, and that's going to be the case. It is extremely deserving. By no means is it a detriment to Jayson Tatum, but it's just a sort of statement on this Celtics roster construction as a whole. But I want to talk more on how the Celtics sort of got to this point, and again, that developing maturity, as well as the idea of what is it going to take, because let's say they win on Friday, they go 80-20 on the season, they join one of 7 teams to win at least 80 games and have 20 or less losses, that it still doesn't feel like they are going to be viewed in the same light of those other all-time teams. So we're going to be diving into what it will take for the Celtics to change that, considering the fact that this season there really isn't much else that they can currently do. But we're going to be answering all of those questions. First, though, a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, continuing on our conversation about the Boston Celtics, who are just one game away from winning the 2024 NBA Finals. I want to talk about the big picture here with the Celtics, who, we've talked about this for weeks now, seem to have been plagued by their overachieving early seasons, at least in the Jaylen Brown, Jayson Tatum era, that has led to the Celtics being under this massive level of scrutiny, despite the fact that they were having a lot of success, all things considered. Obviously, in the NBA, a lot of people are so fixated nowadays on championship or bust, and especially when you are a team from Boston, championships are the expectation, fair or not. And it led to plenty of discourse over the years about whether or not Tatum and Brown could fit together with one another. But I want to sort of look at how the Celtics became this team that, another narrative that has been thrown out is the idea that Jayson Tatum has this super team. I don't think that has always been the case. And even if you were to consider the Celtics a super team this season, the way they went about constructing the roster definitely is not traditional in comparison to the super teams we've seen of the past decade, where it's in free agency, LeBron James, Chris Bosh working their way to Miami, Kevin Durant joining an already tremendous Warriors team. This was the Celtics who drafted their two-star players in Jayson Tatum and Jaylen Brown in the late 2010s. And from there, their front office has just done a tremendous job of sort of buying low on valuable pieces and turning them into bigger players. And that's not necessarily 100% the case. Buying low absolutely is ultimately, I think, the common pattern here, where it's going out in the 2022 season and trading for Derek White, who was just seen as a role player at that time. He was playing alongside DeJounte Murray. DeJounte Murray was seen as more of the star potential player out of that roster. Celtics go out and they get Derek White for a combination of Josh Richardson, Romeo Langford, a 2022 first-round pick that ends up becoming Blake Wesley, and a 2028 first-round pick swap. So ultimately, a late first-round pick and a swap later. Josh Richardson wasn't with the Spurs much longer after that. Romeo Langford still do have some love as a Celtics fan. I still feel like there was a world where he could have fully put it together if the injuries weren't an issue, but ultimately a very low price. They go out and they trade for Kristaps Porzingis. They trade Marcus Smart, who was the real lifeline of the Celtics for a number of the years. He was the longest tenured Celtics even before Brad Stevens or either of the Jays came into the city. They trade him, Danilo Gallinari, and Mike Muscala, as well as the 35th overall pick in last year's draft. They get 2 first-round picks out of the deal, and they then use one of those picks to go get Drew Holiday. So they add Porzingis, coming off of a season in Washington where nobody's paying attention, nobody really cares what in individual players, the numbers they're putting up with the Wizards. And then they go get Drew Holiday, who the Bucks had just moved off of, and they get him in exchange for Malcolm Brogdon, Robert Williams, a 2024 first-round pick from the Porzingis deal, and a 2029 unprotected first-round pick. By the way, on that note, Joel Embiid last night, very interestingly, had sort of threw his 2 cents into the conversation on the Celtics and tweeted out, quote, "Did the Bucks give them a championship?" Specifically referring to the Bucks, who didn't directly trade Drew Holiday to the Celtics, but of course traded him to the Portland Trailblazers in exchange for Damian Lillard, and then the Celtics were able to swoop in and steal Drew Holiday. So let us know in the comments section whether or not you have thoughts on, did the Bucks give them a championship? I did a whole conversation about this last week. You can go check out the video there, but don't necessarily have time to dive into all of that right now. But the Celtics were, as we do have a comment from Eric Rodriguez, the Milwaukee Bucks were bananas for letting go of Drew Holiday. And it's really interesting. Obviously, and again, I'll be a little bit brief here because we did just talk about it last week, but there was some obligation that they had to show Giannis that it was a front office group that was willing to invest into winning from here on out. Giannis was flirting with the idea of potentially leaving Milwaukee, and he said, I go out, leave everything on the court every single game that I play. I need to know that I play for a front office that has that same type of work ethic. So they go out and they get the star in Damian Lillard. But again, I think the Bucks really reconsider whether or not they do that if they know Drew Holiday is going to land with the Celtics. But at the same time, they had to know that one of the top contenders were probably going to make a move for Drew Holiday, whether it be the Celtics, whether it be the Heat as well, also in the Eastern Conference. So it is definitely a little bit of a crazy move for the Bucks, giving up their point of attack defender like Drew is. But ultimately, the Celtics, I understand they are an extremely talented roster, maybe one of the best starting fives of the 2000s, you could even argue, from Drew Holiday, multiple-time All-NBA defense, both of the Jays having Kristaps Porzingis as well, all-star caliber player, and Derek White, who is one of the best role players we have seen in the NBA in recent years. And listen, I don't want to get carried away here and sort of get too high on the Celtics right now, but it's an extremely talented roster, but they were able to do so without necessarily, it seems like at least, going for the home run signing, trade, anything like that. And obviously they knocked it out of the park with Kristaps Porzingis and Drew. As Eric says, Dame time got nothing on Holiday. It's damn Drew. I mean, at this point in their careers, there's a real argument to be made that Damian Lillard, I think all time with the scoring ability of Dame, is, he's going to go down as a Hall of Famer. Drew, probably with another championship as well, can very likely establish himself as a Hall of Fame resume player as well. Looking at his accolades, if he were to win another championship, that's 2 6-time All-Defense, 2-time All-Star. Pretty good case there. But, the Celtics were just able to, evaluate these assets that were available to them, and to the dismay of people who don't like the Celtics, it has been an incredible job. And that's why, from Brad Stevens, who won Executive of the Year, that was really their one accolade as a team that they got. And it's very fair that Brad Stevens has just put together, one of the best contending rosters that we've seen in the 21st century. And I'm not saying that they are on the same level of the Warriors or the Shaq Kobe Lakers necessarily, but on that note, it is going to be very interesting to see, I think, more than anything. Again, Celtics up 3-0 right now. We haven't seen a team in NBA history be able to overcome that. If you feel that the Mavericks can do so, definitely pitch us why in the comments section. I don't think I'm willing to go there, but ultimately, if the Celtics do go on to win this finals, they are going to have an excellent chance next season to at least try and defend their championship. And title defenses are something that I feel like especially come into play when you're talking about the all-time legacies of teams, where we've seen in the NBA in years past that injuries do play such a massive part of the NBA championship just about every single season. And for the Celtics, they benefited from injuries to Jimmy Butler and Donovan Mitchell and Tyrese Halliburton throughout their run in the Eastern Conference. Maybe you even would like to argue that Luka's dealing with these injuries. I say he's playing. That should be enough. The Celtics also haven't had Kristaps Porzingis to that point. But again, all of this bakes into the conversation of the NBA. Because it's such a star-driven league, injuries play a massive difference. And ultimately, for the Celtics, they have a chance next year to try and be the first team since the Kevin Durant Warriors to win a championship and return to the conference finals in the next season. No team has done that in each of the past 5-6 seasons. And it goes to show that the level of parity in the NBA right now is, to some degree at least, at an all-time high. Now you have your top-tier contenders. It doesn't feel like all 30 teams can win a championship necessarily, but at least in terms of just sort of locking in a finals team each season, I don't believe you can really do that, because I would have easily picked the Nuggets to do so this past year, and it seemed like they had an excellent chance to repeat prior to their second round loss against a team that, it's also, the NBA is about matchups, and the Timberwolves, I don't believe in a vacuum are a better team than the Nuggets are, but they were built almost single-handedly by Tim Connolly, who used to work for the Nuggets and then went on to the Timberwolves. Tim Connolly basically built a roster to defeat the monster that he just created in Denver. So again, all of this to be said that the Celtics, if they want to be considered one of the all-time great teams, it's going to come down to how do they respond next season. Like I mentioned earlier in the show, Jaylen Brown and Jayson Tatum have gotten to this point of an emotional maturity that the outside conversations about who is better and doesn't matter if one of us is a bigger star than the other seems to have dissipated, and they play a much more unselfish brand of basketball. Winning the finals is one thing, because neither of these players have done so, and they were hungry to get it done. And I'm sure that next year we're probably going to see that same level of intensity, but as things go on here, they have both won the finals. What else is there to do for them in their NBA careers once they dive into that conversation? Maybe we see Jaylen Brown want to go out and be the number one most marketable star on his team and such. But again, we'll see how a potential championship this season impacts how they go moving forward here. But let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Do you consider this Celtics team one of the all-time teams? But we're going to be taking our final break here, and when we come back on the other side, we have some non-NBA Finals related news with the Cleveland Cavaliers, updates on their head coaching search, and a report that came out about their off-season plans in regards to trying to retain their top 4 players. So stick with us, and we will be right back after this quick break. Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day, where we got a report that came out yesterday from Jake Fisher of Yahoo Sports about the Cavaliers' offseason plans. And amongst other things, what stood out to me was the fact that the Cavs believe that they can continue to contend with their current core of the 4 players, Darius Garland, Donovan Mitchell, Evan Mobley, and Jarrett Allen. Now, I don't think that that is a crazy take, because all 4 of those players I just named are all-star caliber guys, including Jarrett Allen, who I think is one of the more underrated players in the NBA, but we have seen him make an all-star team in 2021-22. So these are all players that are extremely talented and do play winning basketball, I will add to that. But it does feel like there is some level of redundancy with the group that they currently have in terms of Donovan Mitchell and Darius Garland, both 2 guards that really aren't great off of the ball, are primary ball handlers, score off of that, haven't necessarily developed that part of their game where they can necessarily be that elite secondary scorer. And it's tough where, Darius Garland, he showed his promise with the Cavaliers prior to Donovan Mitchell coming into town, where he was an all-star and he was leading the Cavaliers to these successful seasons. And then the front office group thought that it was time to go all in. And the skills just aren't very complementary between Garland and Mitchell. And then you look in the front court as well, Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley, another situation where Mobley, I do believe in the ceiling of him, and I thought there was a lot of promise in what he showed in the postseason run this past year, especially the way that he was really getting himself going in that Celtics series, even when he wasn't having these massive offensive scoring nights, he was still able to at least have the IQ to put himself in the correct dead spots to get himself easy looks as well off of passes, and it was something that was very promising, where Evan Mobley, his stock had probably dipped a little bit since his rookie season, but in large part it's because of the fact that him and Jarrett Allen are both centers that are incredible paint defenders, but in this new world of the NBA where it's so perimeter centric, it means one of them is being dragged out to the 3-point line more often than not. They're not having that same level of impact from a defensive perspective, and then offensively, neither one of them can really space the floor. Now, Mobley is interesting because he did at least start to take a little bit more 3-point shots over the course of this year. I wonder if maybe that's something that he is looking to add in order to have a fit in alongside Jarrett Allen, because again, it would be a scary defensive core if these 2 7-footers can play alongside one another, and again, that redundancy is reduced. As Eric asks in the comments section, I felt the coach did a decent job handling all of those egos on the court. Were the Cavs justified in the firing? It's interesting, right? Because in the 2023 playoffs, it was a very embarrassing loss for the Cavaliers, losing in the first round to a lower-seeded New York Knicks team that, obviously, the Knicks of this year, it was not the same level. Jaylen Brunson was not at the same level individually as he was this season during the 2023 postseason. And also, for all of that size that I'm praising for the Cavaliers, they were just getting outmanned, out-rebound. The physicality was just far too much for them. And that was a really tough look. But to your point, Eric, the egos is something that it does seem like has been, for the most part, a non-problem. I thought the JB Bickerstaff actually did a pretty decent job, considering, especially once Donovan Mitchell was out in the playoff series against the Celtics, of, actually keeping the team together to compete. Marcus Morris he has coming off the bench in Game 5 and is giving the Celtics a run for their money on their home court, and Evan Mobley is turning himself around. So I thought there was a chance that he could have saved his job, but ultimately it's just an extremely difficult position to be in, and I feel like NBA front offices are just far more willing to say that they were wrong on a coach than they were on the actual roster construction, because for the general managers, that's their job, and they're the ones that are in the owners' ears sort of talking about what's going wrong for them. So I wouldn't. The Cavs, I understand it's okay that they fired Bickerstaff. It's interesting. The Fisher report also talked about the candidates that they are bringing in this week alone. They brought into Cleveland James Borrego, who has been one of the main candidates for the Lakers as well, associate head coach of the New Orleans Pelicans. Kenny Atkinson, former Brooklyn Nets head coach, currently an assistant with the Warriors, and Micah Nori, who was the top assistant for the Timberwolves. You probably saw him during this past postseason after Chris Finch had his leg injury and he had to sit on the bench. Micah Nori was essentially the acting head coach, at least on the sideline, even though Finch was still there. But they're bringing in all of them this week. Going to be interesting to see how that plays out. I mean, those are some pretty solid options for them ultimately. But again, is that going to matter when it comes into this next season? Because to Eric's point about the egos, Bickerstaff did a pretty good job of keeping things together, but there was a report earlier in the past month or so that Darius Garland may be looking to request a trade if the Cavaliers can sign Donovan Mitchell to a new contract extension, which, again, it just feels like this team, with its redundancy, a change needs to be made to some degree. Now, they're going with the head coaching change at that, but, I do think that a roster change is going to need to happen. And I believe that the Cavaliers, if things sort of work out for them, if I were them, I'd look to keep Donovan Mitchell on board as long as that's possible. And again, the Jarrett Allen, Evan Mobley thing, you could probably get a lot, I feel like, for if you are trying to push your chips in now. I feel like leaving Evan Mobley sort of on the back burner, I'd probably prioritize him, and I'd probably prioritize Donovan Mitchell in the backcourt so that you have a competitive team right now, but at the same time, you do have something to at least fall back on. Eric throws out in the comments section the possibility of signing Klay Thompson. I mean, I don't know off the top of my head what the Cavaliers' salary cap situation is, but it's interesting. He would be somebody who knows that he could fall into the Warriors' salary cap situation. We know as much as Warriors. I think Warriors fans probably want him back, even though he really struggled this past season. But he is somebody who would be able to play into the sort of secondary guard role and just do his job if he can sort of work his legs back a little bit. I don't know necessarily if he still does have that defensive upside that he did for years when he was with the Warriors. It would be an interesting fit, and I do feel like he can definitely fit somewhat seamlessly into what the Cavaliers are trying to do. Again, if they sort of move on from one of those primary guards as things currently stand. But again, the whole situation is just kind of messy, and I want this to work out for the Cavaliers because, again, I do think that there's real upside, and for the amount of talent that they have on that roster, it would be a waste to never see it come into fruition, really, in a real way. But again, I don't think it's necessarily an easy fix. Now, they have probably the most playing cards for this upcoming offseason, where they can make a number of different moves. The configuration of their roster, they can make a number of different adjustments in accordance to who they end up hiring at head coach and what type of team they want to be. But I do feel like a little bit of that comes down to the identity of this roster, and I couldn't really tell you what it is other than this word that I keep throwing out there, which I myself am being redundant saying it, but that is what the team feels like to me, where it's just clunky, and I don't know if necessarily a new head coach is going to fix that with their current roster. But Before we wrap up the show, I want to get back to Eric's comment from when we were at break with the Celtics having the 2 stars and also role players. They do play unselfish basketball. Eric says it reminds him of Tim Duncan's Spurs years, guys playing for each other, not just the name on the back of the jersey. And I absolutely agree that I think for the Celtics, it has been this level of maturity that, and I think that Jrue Holiday has been a massive part of that, of sort of instilling in the Celtics what it takes for winning a championship and sort of coming into this team first environment. And the Celtics, in turn, we've seen not just with the play on the court and the unselfish play, which is absolutely a valid point, but you listen to them at the podium as well, and there just seems to be this greater understanding of what it takes to be a finals contending team. We have another comment here from Dre. What do you think about Joel Embiid's career and what should he do? Embiid is so interesting because, again, we understand in a world without injuries, Embiid is he's one of the most talented big men that we are probably going to see ever in the 21st century as we continue to move to an era in the NBA where everything is more perimeter centric. Joel Embiid does have a little bit of that spacing ability, but more than anything, the way that he just works the post is something that you don't get often in the NBA nowadays. And ultimately, when you look at like what Dre is saying, Embiid is 30 years old. He's injury prone. There's this new guard coming in, like to his examples, Anthony Edwards and Tyrese Halliburton making all of these conference finals. Embiid is getting passed by in a lot of these instances. And again, you want to talk about the individual talent of Embiid. I mean, he is going to be a Hall of Famer when it's all said and done. But in terms of the overall legacy with him, it does feel like to some degree he doesn't necessarily get slighted quite as much as other stars for the lack of postseason success. You look at the Celtics and Jayson Tatum, who it feels like the Celtics 76ers have definitely a little bit of a rivalry as well. Jayson Tatum, it feels like publicly, is bashed more for the coming up short in the finals than Joel Embiid is for never even making it to a conference finals. And we've seen, Tyrese Halliburton make the East Finals this year. We saw Trae Young in 2021. Now, granted, it was with Joel Embiid also dealing with an injury, and the undoing of Ben Simmons during that series is really when we saw that happen. But Trae Young, with an undermanned Hawks team, beat Embiid to go to the conference finals himself. So it's really interesting. The 76ers have a lot on their plate for this offseason. They only have, I believe it's 3 players under contract for next season. I believe it's Embiid, Paul Reed, and it's one other player. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. It might be Ricky Council. Now, they're going to give Tyrese Maxey a max contract this offseason. He's a restricted free agent. I have no doubts that they're going to bring him back, but they have a lot of spots to fill out on that roster. Do they go with the third star strategy, sort of the traditional super team building model, or do they just try and build around the edges and try and make sure that, you don't have to overpay for they've been stuck with Tobias Harris's contract on the books for years now, which I think has really hurt the way that the 76ers have been able to build their roster over recent seasons as well. So it is, a very interesting conversation. Dre says Anthony Edwards at 22 years old did what Embiid couldn't do at 30 years old as an MVP. That's the thing, though, to your point. Injuries are really one of the main reasons it hasn't come to light for Embiid to have this postseason success. But part of it as well, which can be a conversation that 76ers fans can be a little bit sensitive to, but when you're talking about final possession of a game, and listen, I understand there are a limited number of players that you want creating at the end of a game, But Joel Embiid, he has never really been comfortable with sending those double teams. Now he's improved the passing out of them, but it just doesn't feel like Embiid is somebody who can generate a great look consistently when your back is against the wall, where Anthony Edwards, I mean, obviously Embiid, you know, he is a force in the post, like we just mentioned as well. So it's not that it's impossible for him to get himself a good look, but it just feels like in those moments, there's a very beatable way to get by that. Whereas these other up-and-coming players as well, with their level of shot creation, with the level of athleticism from an Anthony Edwards, as you mentioned, it's just something to consider. And again, I'm not trying to bash Embiid by any means. It is one of the most interesting careers that we've seen in recent time. I wasn't old enough to fully experience the Yao Ming years, and Embiid is probably all time. Again, I don't want to speak down on Yao Ming. I understand I'm a little bit misinformed in terms of that, but a little bit of a similar conversation there where Yao Ming, Hall of Famer as well. Embiid is going to be, but there's just going to be a lot of ifs, I would say, that surround there as well. Dre says, since 2017, Embiid has been in the playoffs. He had a chance. He choked and had the horrible series with great players like Butler, Harden, Simmons, Maxey. I mean, he has had talent around him, absolutely. And as we have the idea from Eric in the comments section talking about, could the 76ers go after Jimmy Butler? I just talked about on the show yesterday some of the hints of Jimmy Butler possibly leaving Miami. Would be interesting to see him back in Philly, because that's probably one of the bigger regrets ultimately for 76ers fans throughout the course of their career. And tying that into Dre's comment about Ben Simmons' career, the 76ers ultimately chose to go with Ben Simmons because of the upside that he was showing at the time over Jimmy Butler, who his reputation was a little bit spottier in terms of his ability to, you know, be fully bought into a team system and his chemistry after working his way directly out of Minnesota back then. As for Ben Simmons' career, I mean, it feels like another type of what if as well, where Ben Simmons, I mean, he was legitimately great. He was one of the best defenders in the league. You talk about a player that was sort of, you know, handmade to try and be a Luka Doncic stopper. I mean, Ben Simmons was built. He had length. I mean, yeah, the next LeBron idea that Dre mentions in the comments section, he had that build. He had the passing IQ as well, which is what made these similarities to LeBron. And ultimately, I mean, I have no faith really in Ben Simmons moving forward. We're finally getting into the season already of Ben Simmons posting all of these, you know, maybe this is definitely the wrong term to say, but it's almost a thirst trap for basketball fans, where it's him in the gym knocking down shots, putting in all of the work, and talking about how, you know, the comeback is going to be great, and then we don't see him play, and there's always something bothering him. It's a shame, because I do legitimately think that, you know, there was a world where he could have been, I don't know necessarily the next LeBron. That was always extreme, but he had the frame of doing so. As Eric says, how does Simmons go from the future of the NBA to a basketball media punching bag? It's because mentally he's weak. And, you know, listen, he might have stuff in his life that almost, I don't want to say justifies necessarily, but we all have things going on in our own lives that impact the ability of the job that we do. And I feel like that has to be the case of Simmons to some degree. We saw him, especially when it comes to the jump shooting, that was a massive issue for him. And it's not like we see these videos, as corny as they are, but he's knocking down these jump shots in practices and stuff. But then when he comes into these big stages, he just kind of freezes up in terms of his three-point ability, which just leads me to believe that it's something mentally with him, which is obviously an extremely tricky thing to unpack. And As for Simmons, I mean, what was he? He was the first round pick in 2016. So he's probably something like in his late 20s, 27, 28 years old at this point. As double checking real quick, he's going to turn 28 later this year. So, in theory, he could still, be something in the NBA. But at the same time, it's just, it's tough to sort of, watch this all play out the way that it has for somebody who was an all defensive caliber player for years. He was all NBA in 2019-20. It's just, again, I think that we're probably going to get some sort of a bigger picture story from Simmons probably after his retirement as to a little bit more of a deep dive into what went wrong. But it was just sort of, it was just a diminishment over time. And again, I think that it stems from the mental aspect of the game as well. But that is all the time we have for today. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you to our viewers for helping to contribute to the conversation. Always happy to hear your thoughts on the matter. We are live every 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern on weekdays, so we will be back tomorrow. Remember to like, follow, subscribe wherever you keep up with us. As for now, I'm TJ Mabarty. Thank you for tuning in and take care.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day. Yeah, I'm tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.